We are the women who stand true. We are the women who stand strong. We are your mothers, your sisters and your daughters. We are the women who stand true.
Hi, I'm Chris Almvig, and I'm fortunate to be one of the founders of SAGE, and I wish I could be with you all tonight to help celebrate Women's History Month and the 40th anniversary of SAGE. Back in 1976, we used the term gay community, so I hope you understand why my conversation doesn't include LGBT. Pardon me for using notes. It's been 40 years, so I need to jog my memory a little bit. I bet many of you have felt passionate and still do about making a difference. And that's what happened to me. I thought maybe you'd like to hear my story and then hear about the first few years that I was involved with SAGE and some of the women who dared to come out publicly at a time that was personally daunting and uncertain of the consequences. Forgive me too if I leave out the names of some dedicated women who took a chance and became involved in the early years. Growing up a Midwesterner, I was drawn to older people in my family and older people in my neighborhood, and I completed a year on my master's degree in social work with a concentration in gerontology outside of Chicago, but I left the program, and after that first year, I began my first significant job as not a social worker, but a social director down in Lake of the Ozarks, Missouri, at a big resort where 1,000 people stayed every night. And that's where I came out. But the employees seemed to be as transient as the guests, and I became lonely and confused with nobody to talk to. But then this guy Bob, a gay guy who ran the health spa, kind of took me under his wing, and he said he would introduce me to some older gay people that he knew that had retired down to the lake from Kansas City and St. Louis and Chicago, and they had all been retired professionals, and they all had lovely homes on the lake and boats, and they would get together for this brunch once a month on a Sunday, and it was a progressive thing. They would all go from house to house, and so Bob made me promise, though, that if he took me, that I wouldn't mention anything or ask them any questions about being gay. And of course, here I had just come out and I had all these questions. He even made me put my hand over my heart and promise that I wouldn't ask them anything. And as it turns out, they were all alcoholic, and having been in the closet for their entire lives, they had internalized their homophobia to the extent that they didn't talk about being gay to each other. They didn't even acknowledge when one of the people in the group had lost a partner. I found it all very sad, and the excitement of my own self-discovery was overtaken by feelings of disappointment. And then I started questioning, was this going to be my life? Was this the life of all older gay people? So I told my friend Mary, who was an architectural student intern who was doing her internship at the resort, and I told her about my experience, and although she wasn't a lesbian, she had a lot of gay guy friends, and she became very empathetic about what my experience had been. And she had these rolls of architectural paper, huge rolls, and she came to my room. I lived on the resort, and we spread it out on the floor, and we each had like magic markers, and we started to draw what we called Radcliffe Hall. It was going to be, in our minds, a gay retirement community. And so we draw the Billie Jean King Health Spa and the Florence Nightingale dining room, and and the Gertrude Stein Library and things like that. Because we thought, and she had a social work minor, so we thought that, you know, if a safe place would exist for older gay people, that there was, you know, a perfect chance that they could have successful aging. But it hadn't existed up until then. So about a year later, I met a woman who was part of a convention staying at the resort, and she was so butch that at first glance you would have thought she was a man. She was with this convention, and there was nobody that I could meet, and so obviously I came on to her and had a 6-month affair. It turned out that driving 3 hours to see her in St. Louis was the easy part. Listening to her life story of undergoing dishonorable discharge from the Army during the witch hunt years, resulting in difficulty all through her life obtaining a job. She danced on the stage when she was young with top hat and tails, and she passed as a man in a lesbian bar and in San Francisco. That's where she was from, and it was raided, and she was kicked in the ribs and in the stomach by the police and thrown into the back of a police car van, which caused a big gash in her head, and she had to have stitches and resulted in a broken arm. So, you know, listening to these lifelong issues that she underwent had more of an impact on me. And the fact that she had to stay close to home because she couldn't go into a men's bathroom, she couldn't go into a women's bathroom, there would be an issue, just like transgendered people have some problems today. And if transgendered surgery had been available in those years, she would have been the perfect candidate. Her name was Pat, and her experience certainly changed a lot of my thinking. So after 3 years of living at the resort, I moved to Kansas City in order to find a gay community, and what I found was the Kansas City Women's Liberation Union. It was the radical end of the women's movement, and that's where I became immersed in feminism and began public speaking. I got fired for being a lesbian from the Jewish Community Center, but met a marvelous woman who was traveling from New York to California and stopped off in Kansas City to see an old friend. Now, it's interesting in retrospect how I can see how different people along my life journey and circumstances led to what I came to see as my destiny. So Carol Bloom, who I hope is here tonight. Hi, Carol, if you are. Carol and I fell in love, and I moved to New York City to be with her and begin a life with her. And Carol thought that my dream of retirement housing for social services and retirement for the older gay community was commendable. So she generously subsidized my master's degree in Gerontological Services Administration at the New School for Social Research. And she thought that if I had credentials, that would support my efforts in getting something going, like a not-for-profit. So while working on my thesis on older lesbians and gay men, the final thesis to graduate, I talked with gay community groups in New Jersey and Long Island and all over the city, and as a result, I became the contact for older gay people from the Gay Switchboard. And through being the contact person, I heard horrendous stories from gay people around the country who would call, and some of them were in fear of their lives. And there were many times that I'd get off the phone in tears. One day, though, I got a call from Jim Dorff, and he was a bond broker, a great guy, who had gotten my name from the Gay Switchboard. And he said that his partner, who had cancer and was much older than he was, didn't have a support network. he didn't have one and his partner didn't have one. And he said, let's talk about putting something together. And I said, well, I'd really like to, but you know, I'm work full time and I'm going to graduate school, and I'd kind of like to just graduate and then boy, I'm ready to roll. And he says, oh, there's no time like the present, you know, to ask a busy person to do one more thing and they can usually find a way to do it. So we put together a meeting. Jim invited people that he knew. I invited people that I knew from the gay social workers group that I'd been a part of. I wanted to make sure that a woman was present, so I asked my old friend Jerry Calvis if she'd come. So it was clear that night in 1976 that there was enough interest to continue. A guy from the Village Voice was only there at that first meeting, and he's the one that came up with the name SAGE. And it's been a great name to have all these years. So the first meeting was at Jim Dorf's townhome, and then the subsequent board meetings and a lot of committee meetings were held at Carol's and my apartment on 86th and Broadway. Some nights of the week, Carol would have a Gay Teachers Association meeting in the apartment, and the next night we'd have a SAGE meeting. So those years were exhilarating. We became incorporated in 1997, and we developed an advisory committee. We wrote a grant, we got funded, we got space in St. Luke's in the Field Episcopal Church. And that was for our very first office. It was a beautiful setting in a garden, and we were good to go. We knew that providing services for the homebound and those in need was our main objective, and we thought once we got that going, we would move into opportunities for socialization. That would be next. So a volunteer outreach and training committee was formed, and then came a committee for fundraising and publicity. As exciting as it was to make my dream come true, I must say that the first few years were challenging and sometimes hostile. In terms of being the only woman in a leadership position, or the only woman on the board for a couple years. And the thing was that the guys didn't understand the concept of consensus. And that was something I learned from the feminist movement. It worked really well, but they weren't used to that kind of leadership. That was difficult. Despite the fact that I was the driving force behind moving SAGE forward, the board, again, all men except for me, didn't want me to be president. They thought that Emery Hetrick, who's another great guy, but they felt that Emery should be our first president because he was a doctor. They thought, wouldn't it look good to have MD on the letterhead? Emery was much too busy to be the first president, so he asked me if I would put together the agenda and the talking points for the meetings. I'd hand it to him and he'd run the meeting. Then he just was too busy to do it the next year, and by then everybody felt more comfortable with my style of leadership, so the second year I became the president. There were men in the organization that only had other men in their lives. There were men who had only worked with women who had been in subservient roles where they worked, like assistants and secretaries. There were men that, because they'd never even thought about women's issues, were not necessarily misogynist, but indifferent. So I had to be extra vigilant to bring up women's issues, and I had to be very prepared, and I was. When I suggested parity on the board, they thought it would never work, and maybe that was unrealistic for even the second year, because it was still hard for women to come out in the 70s. Here's the story. One of our board members was an older gay man who had held a fundraising position with a high-level not-for-profit in the city. now retired, he felt that he could join SAGE, and he revealed that through his life he'd never had sex that he hadn't paid for. He was afraid of being blackmailed, and so he had a very sad life. And now that he wasn't working and he was away from everybody that he knew from the work world, he was like a kid in a candy store, but he had no consciousness at all about gay culture or recognition for our struggle. And because he was older, and it would have been nice to have an older person on the board, and he had fundraising expertise, he was elected to the board. But his offensive behavior towards some of our volunteers came to the forefront. A lot of phone calls from volunteers saying that they were approached by him inappropriately. I asked for an executive committee meeting and attempted to have a vote to have him removed, but the old boy executive committee stood by him. And we lost a number of really good volunteers because of him. When we received our first grant, the same board member that I speak of swayed the vote from electing me as SAGE's first director and stating that a man would have more influence in fundraising and with the media. Well, my intention was to be the director for the first 2 years, get it off the ground, and then go on to do something else. And we would do a search committee and find somebody who had a serious background in administration and business. And I had proposed that. But at the board meeting that we were going to have to develop a search committee, it was voted that we would have a search committee and not select me. So I was heartbroken, and I resigned. Sometimes I am sorry that I resigned, but given the emotionality of it all at the time, it seemed like the only thing I could do. I stayed in the background for a few years, and I was pleased that I could talk Ken Dawson, who I'd known previously, that I could convince Ken Dawson to go ahead and accept the position to be the executive director of SAGE, and boy, he was a gem. He was marvelous. And then it was thrilling to speak before the City Council on Intro 1, the Lesbian and Gay Rights Bill. City Council, that was a thrill. So I stayed involved in the background. And I know SAGE has evolved from the rudimentary days of raising men's consciousness and has given rise to providing information and services we thought that we couldn't have imagined. But tonight I rattle my 71-year-old memory to salute women who had a similar dream to mine and made a difference to move SAGE forward. Remember, it was a time that coming out on a letterhead or having your name in the corporate papers meant you could potentially be fired and labeled. The first year, some women were willing to join committees and be involved in activities, and they encountered some of the same issues that I encounter, but again, it was not necessarily misogyny, it's just men not used to meeting women with the same professional level. But we all persevered. Some women volunteered for a single project, but found so much success that they wound up joining the board later, such as Dr. Julia Rux, who helped create a volunteer training, or Dr. Anna Dumois, who raised gay aging consciousness with New York City nonprofits, or Valerie Levy, who was the director of Minority Affairs at the New York City Department for the Aging. And she made certain that gay people were designated as an official minority in all the city's the aging funded programs. She served on our advisory committee for many years. Many women worked on creating committees and committee structure. Liza Kelly, Dr. Barbara Berger, Barry Greenwald, Dr. Jerry Nussdorf, Nat Nevins, Catherine Mayorisi, Nikki Zacuto, Carol Buell, Carolyn Chadwick, Audrey Seidman, Sandy Chernick, Nath Rockhill, Dr. Gloria Donadello, Helen Leeds, Dr. Nina Zasorin, Eileen Corrigan, Joyce Litz, Barbara Barracks, Liz Ferris, and more. And I'm so sorry if I left anyone out from the first couple years. Our first grant that enabled us to hire a director and a coordinator of direct services brought us Morgan Gwenwald, MSW, who organized our office and created a program of outreach to seniors and volunteers. Once we moved to the Gay Community Center, Michelle Schwartz, MSW, became the coordinator of direct services, and she moved us to the next level. Some of our volunteers who didn't want to be quite so high profile by joining a committee, or clients who wanted to contribute in some way, were Jerry Kalbas, Audrey Seitzova, Florence Holland, May Gompers and Marion Lonsdorf, Jerry Fair, Melvina Schwartz, otherwise known as Bubble Kent. So I'd like to elaborate on some of these women. Barry Greenwald. She owned a printing and graphics company, and I asked her to design the layout for my research survey that I used for my master's thesis at the New School. And I realized she was a closeted lesbian. Surviving cancer, she realized that it was time for her to come out, and she joined SAGE. Her company designed our first brochure, our flyers, our newsletters, and posters. She eventually joined the board and became a co-president. Audrey Seidman worked for a major New York City nonprofit, and with skills in publicity, authored our first news release in 1979, which brought in a lot of articles from major newspapers, including the New York Times. She became our newsletter editor, consultant on all media materials, and then later secretary of the board and co-chair of the board, and she had unbounding energy. A few memories. Barbara Berger was working on a project in our first office at St. Luke's in the Field, and a male volunteer came up to her and said, Barbara, would you take a letter? And Barbara looked up at him and said, I don't know what you mean. And he said, you type a letter for me. I want you to type a letter for me. She says, I'm sorry, I never learned how to type. And he was in disbelief. He said, what do you mean you never learned how to type? How do you work? How do you do anything? She says, well, I don't know. I've been in medical school. I haven't learned how to type. I haven't had time. So that's the kind of level of guys having to have race consciousness. Jerry Kalbas was almost 30 years older than I was, but I was pretty young, so she wasn't really on the older side, but she did have gray hair, and she was my friend, and I pleaded with her, would she please agree to have her picture taken. We found these 3 other older gay guys, and we wanted to put a picture on our first newsletter. So she agreed. And since then, she has volunteered on the social committee for years, the women's dance committee. She's chaired flea markets. She's been willing to give countless interviews on behalf of SAGE. And Jerry was really proud of being one of the Rosie the Riveters during the war, World War II, and being the chef at Bonnie and Clyde's at the lesbian bar in the village. Carolyn Chadwick was our first friendly visitor and was selected to be matched with a client, Audrey Seitzova. Both Carolyn and Audrey agreed to be photographed for SAGE publicity campaigns, and their pictures were on posters, and it helped us a lot. Carolyn has maintained an almost 40-year friendship with Jerry Kalbas and provides support for her to this day. Jerry Fair was what they call a real piece of work. Feisty, outspoken, unfiltered, and unafraid to blast out of the closet as an older woman. She demanded a lot of attention, but boy, she helped the organization a lot. She knew how to raise money, and she was willing to be on panels and a radio and a couple of TV programs. And then nobody knew the name Melvina Schwartz. To everyone at SAGE, she was Bubbles Kent. Bubbles flaunted the fact that she'd been a stripper and a male impersonator in her younger days. And then to make a stable living, she became an X-ray technician. And then when she retired, she could finally be herself, and again, very outrageous and very butch, but a beloved member of the social committee. You could always get a wonderful glass of punch from her. For 30 years, Florence Holland had been the warden at the Women's House of Detention that was located by the Jefferson Market in the West Village. I was friends with her niece, and knowing that Florence liked to write, I convinced her to join the SAGE Writers' Workshop. It was the first time Florence used the authentic pronouns in her writing, and that meant a lot to her. At her funeral, not only was it not mentioned that she was a lesbian, but her 45-year relationship with Ruth was not mentioned. I thought I would scream. In fact, I think I did scream when I got to the street. Our first women's event was held in our center on Hudson Street. Over 45 women attended. It was an exciting night, and I met a woman I went home with that night and was in a relationship for 2 years, so it was a success in many ways. We held women's conferences that were attended by over 100 women, and the development of the SAGE women's dances were destined to not only be major fundraisers, but marvelous opportunities for friendships to begin. The Women's Dance Committee has kept SAGE in the spotlight for women for almost 40 years now. I can only jog my memory so far, but it seemed like in those first 3 or 4 years I was on a perpetual high from witnessing the growth of SAGE and meeting so many marvelous lesbians and gay men. Many of our cherished women volunteers and clients have passed away since the inception of SAGE, but I believe their spirit remains as SAGE moves forward and expands services. Because I resigned after the first few years, I was not aware of the next wave of women's leadership, but it's clear that countless women have stepped up and are living their own dreams. I also want to acknowledge that SAGE volunteers had supportive significant others and friends that encouraged them. I must once again single out Carol Bloom for her encouragement and support and willingness to have SAGE board meetings and committee meetings in our living room over the years. As Hillary says, it takes a village. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Again, I sure wish I could be there. Thanks for all that you do for SAGE. Bye.
We are the women who stand true. We are the women who stand strong. We are your mothers, your sisters, and your daughters. We are the women who stand true. We are the women who walk proud. We are the women who walk strong. We are your mothers, your sisters, and your daughters. We are the women who walk proud. We are the women who run free. We are the women who run strong. We are your mothers, your sisters, and your daughters. We are the women who run free. We are the women who stand true. We